Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So today we continue to talk about narrative, but we're going to focus on a more specific area of narrative this week, and that is description. A very important part of any successful narrative will be descriptive language and good descriptive details. So we're going to be working on this stuff throughout the week so we can get ready to start working on our descriptive narratives next week. So if you guys have looked at the syllabus or if you've checked out the assignments in a little bit more detail in Canvas, you've probably noticed by now that our first major essay is the descriptive narrative. So let's pay attention to both words in the title. We know what narratives are. We've been reading examples for the last couple of weeks, but let's also remember that our narratives that we eventually write need to also be descriptive. They need to have good descriptive language in order to be fully successful. So that's what we're going to work on this week. And then by week 5, next week, we're going to be putting together our first essays. So let's just think a little bit more about what description is. Much like narration, this is a writing style or a writing technique that most of us are already familiar with. We've already experienced description at various times in our lives. We all describe things, both in writing and in everyday speech, when we're just talking to one another. If you ever want to make yourself understood to other people, chances are you are using description. You are describing various things in order to make your meaning understood. So no matter what kind of writing situation we find ourselves in or speaking situation, whether it's formal, informal, in school, at work, during our leisure time, we all use description. It's a very important tool, not just for writing, not just for English class, but really for communication in general. All communication, all successful communication sort of relies on a certain amount of description. So let's talk about all of the different things we can describe, right? So we can describe people. We can describe places. We can describe things like inanimate objects, small, large. We are surrounded by objects. If you're ever describing a room or a house or a street or a car, right? There's always objects around us. Some of those things might belong to us, other things might not, but there's always lots of objects, lots of mechanical devices or other such things that we can describe. Those are always around people. We can also describe animals. We can describe nature if we want to. We could describe the weather or other sort of natural events or natural phenomena. So, a lot of different things we can describe, and with all of those different categories, we can describe those items physically, meaning we really take inventory of appearance and the sort of like physical, tangible existence of things. So you can always describe what things look like. You can also describe like their location in time and space, like how they're arranged. You can do this with people. You can also do this with objects. So what they look like, where they are, like in the space that we're operating with. So like if we're in a room, if the characters of your story are all sitting in a room talking, you might describe the people, how they look, how they sound, how they're dressed, right? You could really attend to a lot of those physical details, and then you could also tell us about all the objects in the room and how those objects are arranged, but also how the people are arranged. Jack is to the left of Sam. Julie is sitting across from Stacy, right? So there's all of these directional details about location, how things occupy time and space. So all of that's like physical. what stuff looks like, how stuff is arranged, using our sensory impressions. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but we can always provide those kinds of physical descriptions, whether we're talking about people, places, or things. But we can also provide what might be called psychological descriptions. So we can also describe what people are feeling, what people are thinking. We might do that sometimes with some of the characters in a narrative. We might want to show readers what a character is feeling, what a character is thinking. So we can describe thoughts, feelings, moods, and also actions. And some of those might be kind of concrete and tangible. Actions often are, if these are real actions that are being carried out in like real time. But you guys know, like thoughts and feelings, those are more abstract. A feeling doesn't really have a tangible physical existence the same way a desk does or a human does, right? A feeling exists primarily in somebody's mind, or if you want to think of it as being in somebody's heart, but it's kind of internal, right? Doesn't have so much of an external existence that can be easily cataloged. So those are more abstract ideas, thoughts, feelings, stuff that's largely happening inside the minds of characters. But we can still describe that stuff. So we can describe it whether it's concrete and physical or whether it's internal, abstract, and, just largely in somebody's head. It really doesn't matter. So just remember, we have lots of options. We have lots of power when it comes to description. We can describe lots of things, and we can provide lots of good descriptive details to make those things come alive, to make those things clear and easily understandable to our readers. That's often the goal, right? That's why authors utilize description, is to make things seem real, to make things seem vivid, to make the fictional scenario or the nonfiction scenario that is still unfamiliar to readers, to make those things really come home, to make them really take on life and meaning, and to make them really easy to picture or easy to understand for an audience. So we're going to see the importance even before we start using these for ourselves. All right, so let's talk about some of the key concepts that we need to know when it comes to description, so we can all use these shared definitions. Let's start with dominant impression. All right, so this is very similar to what we were talking about when we discussed narrative point in relation to narrative. So remember, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about that term narrative point, and it just means the overall meaning or point of a narrative. So I mentioned that we often use the word theme to refer to this, right? What is the theme of the story? What is the meaning? What is the message that the author is trying to communicate? Sometimes we might think of the theme as sort of being a moral or a lesson that we can learn from. That's not always the case, but sometimes it is. In other cases, the theme just might be an idea that the author is interested in, a concept that the text is exploring, or, just something for us to think about. There might not necessarily be a lesson, but there's always a meaning. There's always a larger point. And we do often call that the theme. So just like all narratives have a theme, all descriptions will have a dominant impression. Okay? And the dominant impression is like the theme of that particular description. It is the overall meaning or point that that particular description is trying to get across. So anytime you sit down to write a description, you need to have an idea of what kind of dominant impression you want to communicate. So what is the main idea that you want to get across to your reader about this person, place, or thing that you are describing? So this is important. This is kind of an important decision to make, and it will be influenced by whatever it is you're describing and whatever you're trying to accomplish in your narrative. So there could be a wide range of potential goals. If you are writing a horror story and you are describing a haunted house, then you're obviously going for a particular kind of dominant impression, right? This is the impression that you want to give your readers about this thing that you are describing. So, this is how you want your readers to think about the thing you're describing, how you want them to feel about it. What is going to be their main takeaway after they read this description? So, if you're describing a haunted house, you're obviously going to want your readers to be scared. You're going to want them to be nervous, apprehensive, afraid of what might happen next, uncertain. So, if you want them to feel in those ways, if you want to give them that kind of impression, well, that's going to lead you to describe the haunted house in certain ways. You're going to emphasize certain details that are going to be creepy and mysterious, and they're going to convey that dominant impression that you want. They're going to make readers feel about that haunted house the way you want them to feel, which is scared of it. They don't want to be there. They don't want the characters to be there. They might be scared for the character's safety as the characters walk through the house, or, whatever's going on in your plot. So you're always making these decisions as the writer based on your plot, your characters, what kind of narrative you're writing, what your larger goals might be. But you always want to think, okay, how do I want my readers to respond to this thing that I'm describing? How do I want them to feel about it? What do I want their dominant impression to be? And then you can select the right details, put them in the right order, and it's going to help you to get organized as you're writing your description, because you have a clear goal. You know what you're trying to accomplish, so now you can accomplish it. All right, so let's remember that one. And next we have point of view. So we talked about point of view before in relation to narratives. If you guys remember, we talked about the fact that all narratives have a narrator. Somebody has to tell the story, right? And we talked about some of the different types of narrators that we might encounter. We might find first-person narrators, and that's usually going to be when the protagonist or the main character of the narrative is telling the story. So you can tell by the use of those personal pronouns. I did this. I did that. This other thing happened to me. So when you see that, typically the main character is telling the story. So that's one point of view that we can notice narratively. And then we talked about third person point of view, where we have often a more omniscient third person narrator who's more neutral, more distant from the action, not necessarily one of the main characters, although we could certainly consider an omniscient third person narrator to be a type of character. But they're not really in the thick of the action. They're more detached. They're more distant, kind of observing. And remember, if the third person narrator is omniscient, that means they are all knowing. So they know what every character is thinking, what every character is up to. Not all third person narrators will be omniscient, but they are more neutral. And they're telling the story largely consisting of other people, right? He did that. John did that. Stacy felt a certain way when that happened. Right? So we can usually tell those different types of narrative point of view. But now let's think about point of view in relation to description. So just like before, we can really think of this component of description, the point of view or the perspective of description as focusing, as existing on both a physical level and then also a psychological level. All right, so think about the point of view that you would have if you are describing something. Let's just use ourselves as a first person narrator for a moment. Let's imagine that I or you might be climbing a mountain. Think about your different points of view, your different potential perspectives on this thing that you are describing. Okay, so let's think about the different possibilities. At the beginning of this ascent, before I've started my climb, I'm standing at the bottom and I'm looking up at the mountain. Think about that physical point of view. I'm literally looking up at this very imposing, natural phenomenon. So that's a very particular point of view. That's a very particular perspective, right? In terms of my relationship physically to the thing being described. I'm at the bottom, I'm looking up. So I have a particular physical perspective that's going to influence my description, right? It looks a certain way from the ground. I'm looking up. Maybe I can't see the top. It's shrouded in mist. I'm very intimidated because the mountain looks so large and I am so small in comparison. So there's also that psychological dimension, right? I'm scared. I'm nervous. The mountain makes me feel insignificant in comparison. So that's my point of view from the bottom at the beginning of my climb. But now let's fast forward 3 or 4 hours later. I don't know, however long it would take to get halfway up a large mountain. Now I'm halfway up. So now I have a very different point of view. I have a very different physical perspective, right? Now I can look down and see the part of the mountain that I've already climbed. I can look down at the ground where I started, and I can also look up and maybe I'm able to see the top now, or I'm just at least closer to the top. So my physical location has changed. Therefore, my perspective has changed. My physical point of view has changed. I have sort of a different physical relationship with the mountain now. But also, my psychological point of view has probably also changed. Perhaps I'm not as frightened. I'm not as intimidated now because I've made it halfway up. I'm starting to gain confidence. And then if we fast forward a little bit more, I've reached the summit. I've made it to the top of the mountain. So now, obviously, my point of view is very different. If I'm writing a description from the top, well, I'm going to have a lot of different details, a lot of different sort of things to observe because now I have this wonderful vista, right? I'm at the summit, so I can see for miles around. I can see the surrounding countryside. So very, very different from my point of view at the beginning of the climb. And of course, also my psychological point of view is different now because I've accomplished my goal. I have conquered the mountain. So I'm feeling better. I'm feeling satisfied, content. Certainly, I'm physically tired, but psychologically feeling pretty good. So we could notice all of those differences based on physical point of view, like where you are, where you're located on the mountain, but then also psychological point of view. How are you feeling about the mountain? What is your psychological relationship with the mountain? Is it making you feel a certain way? Is it making you feel a positive emotion, a negative emotion, maybe something in between, some kind of combination of conflicted emotions? That's all stuff that you can describe. That's all really good detail to provide to really flesh out character and to give your readers more to sort of think about. So always consider those two levels of point of view, both physical and psychological. So yeah, if you're using a first person narrator, you're often going to ask yourself, okay, what is my first person narrator's relationship with this thing that's being described? And that might not often be your own relationship. If you're sort of envisioning the first person narrator as yourself or as like a version of you or a stand-in for you, then you can think about your own point of view when it comes to description. But if you're using a third person narrator, you still want to describe things, right? And if you're describing things from the perspective of a character, you might want to think about what that character's physical and psychological relationship is to the thing being described, even if the character themselves might not be doing the description. If your narrator is describing something through the eyes of somebody else, that's a little bit more complex, but obviously you can still do it. You just need to think about that character. How does the character feel? How does the character maybe respond to this mountain? And that's going to influence some of the details that you provide, right? Or if it's an omniscient third person narrator who's describing something from that point of view of a third person omniscient narrator, then maybe think about how the omniscient narrator feels. Sometimes omniscient narrators have thoughts and feelings about the things that they are narrating. So maybe they have a relationship with what's being described. So just think about that. That's going to influence a lot of your choices as you're writing. All right, next up, let's talk about organization. So, how you organize your descriptions will be based on the dominant impression and your point of view. So, you have a lot of different options to choose from when it comes to how you're going to organize a particular description. So, if you're describing a person or a place, you don't just want to have a random assortment of observations. You want some kind of structure. Again, it's almost like the larger narrative. You need a structure. You need a way to unfold the plot. You need a framework for everything to fit into. That's true even for shorter, smaller